Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Dr. Clemens Suter-Crazzolara, Vice President Product Management for Health and Precision Medicine at SAP, a global IT company. Welcome, Clemens, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
Great. So, in the popular press, there's an occasional story about ethics and artificial intelligence, sometimes in the context of healthcare, but more often about autonomous vehicles doing something or making a bad decision. And I guess my question is healthcare artificial intelligence ethics on the same continuum as self-driving car artificial intelligence ethics, or are they different in some fundamental way?
Well, I think the key thing is, of course, when are people's lives at stake? And that is, of course, something what we are all concerned about. You can create beautiful artificial intelligence algorithms and scenarios for all kinds of different processes that you would like to cover. But as soon as you come into an area where the patient's life is at risk, then of course it gets a bit tricky.
Right. So, I mean, in the autonomous car situation, often the example given is, well, you know, in a certain circumstance, the car is going to have to make a decision who dies, basically, right? And hopefully, when we're talking about artificial intelligence in the context of healthcare, that's not necessarily that kind of choice that's being made. But could you speak a little bit more about sort of the what are we navigating when we're looking at that?
Well, first of all, I would like to pick up, David, if that's okay for you, this example from the autonomous car.
Right.
Because imagine the following situation. There's this car driving on the street. It is driving by itself. And at a certain point, the typical example is, do I go in a critical situation to the left and kill somebody who's a pensioner,
right,
or a smaller boy, for instance.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is, of course, what we should not forget is that if a human being is driving this car, I think that both persons would probably suffer in the end. Yeah, because human beings are in many cases not at all possible to take a rational decision like that in that situation. So I think in this discussion we have to be a bit careful as well. We should not lose sight of the opportunities that we have. But on the other side, of course, it is something that is very worrisome for many people. Yeah, that is very serious topic that we have to consider. Now, in healthcare case, it is. I think it's also an interesting observation that artificial intelligence would make it potentially possible to really enhance the prevention, the diagnosis, but also the prevention of certain diseases. So that is a huge advantage that we have. At the moment, we have to realize, of course, that these decisions are being made by specialists, and they are physicians, of course, right? They have studied this, they have years and years of expertise in this area, and these are the people that we trust to make the right decision. The question is, of course, and that is maybe what we can discuss today, is whether we can get with an artificial intelligence algorithm to a stage where we can actually start augmenting the capabilities of the physician. I don't think we should thinking about replacing people, but it is really about how can we help these people to do their job better.
Right, that's the perpetual tension. Are we building something that replaces the human touch, or do we need to layer in an artificial intelligence with the human touch, filtering it through human experience, human judgment, human decision making? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion here in the States about software as a medical device,
right,
and sort of the black box problem, sort of an AI, an evolving, a learning AI that it's one black box today, it's a different black box next week.
Yeah.
Do we need to go back to FDA for another approval?
Yeah.
How do they even review it? What's the approach going to be? There have been a couple of different approaches. I mean, one is sort of let's apply the black box to something where we can do a side-by-side trial, a comparison. Okay, clinicians over here black box over there, and if the false positives and false negatives or whatever the question being posed is, is roughly the same as on the human side, then okay, as good as human, we'll let it go. But then that algorithm changes. It's a learning algorithm. It changes over time.
Right.
How do we look at it again? So, how do you look at those kinds of questions as the technology teaches itself to be better?
Yeah, I think you are already looking at scenarios that, from my viewpoint, are relatively far out in the future, because these are things that I think are fantastic if you can really start implementing them. When we look at hospitals that we work with as a software provider, we see that many people have relatively small scope questions. So they say, for instance, we have some prototypes and products created in that direction. They say, for instance, we know that to diagnose dementia in patients, is something that you usually do with the help of a questionnaire. So the physician asks questions of the patients, and has a conversation, and has a relatively subjective measurement for this. Well, you can say I use an algorithm which can listen to the voice, for instance, of this person, or the words that this person chooses. And then you get a very, I would say, almost narrow scope artificial intelligence algorithm, which is almost not like a black box anymore, because it is very narrow scoped, and it can do a very precise analysis and then support the physician during the conversation and simply give a score and say, with this person the risk is 5 on a scale of 10. Yeah. So I think what we have to come to at the stage is that we say we have to be very conscious and think very hard about what kind of data do we first of all put into this algorithm to train it, and secondly, once we have trained the algorithm, how can we then test over time in a continuous process that it is really delivering the answers that we would like to have. So you need a lot of interaction with the physician to build this up and to start controlling this. And
it's a feedback loop. It's not a delivered product.
Exactly. It is a feedback.
It's not done day one.
Yeah. It is definitely a feedback loop, because otherwise you really run the risk that you also introduce bias. And I think the bias problems are familiar to you as well. Probably. So if we look, for instance, at data about cancer patients, in many cases they are only from one ethnic group. Right? And the other ethnic groups are completely ignored. And then it is very difficult to start using this data. So you have to have...
on that particular issue, I heard a presentation at Harvard recently about a breast cancer algorithm developed in the UK, data drawn from Caucasian women only.
Yeah.
And the results were not only... off, they were consistently wrong, opposite, when dealing with women of other races. So
it is a very difficult issue. Actually, I was talking to a major institute in Germany as well about this topic, the Fraunhofer. They are a very famous institute, and they said the difficulty that we simply have is where is the data set that we can feed into the algorithm to train it, and then to start testing it, and that is, I think, something which is very crucial.
Right.
And you cannot move too fast there. You have to do your due diligence. You have to really keep the patient at the center of the attention. How am I going to help this individual?
Right. Yeah. Right. So there have been a number of initiatives in the States around collecting 1 million genomes. There's several of those floating around.
Right.
The latest is the NIH project, the All of Us research project, and the idea is to cut across various lines of socioeconomic and race categories, so as to be able to develop a useful data set that incorporates information from all sorts of people. Hopefully that can be used then to develop some diagnostics and treatment protocols. So do you see that as part of the ethics question, sort of building a good product, or is that sort of a separate question before we get to the ethics?
I think that's a bit of a separate question, I would say. I think that if we approach artificial intelligence in the right way, what we have to do, for instance, we as a software provider, we have to talk to our customer. What is exactly the issue that you would like to solve? I can give you another example. We have one customer who said, artificial intelligence is very interesting and we have a very good scenario for you. We have a difficulty with fraud. Sometimes people come to the hospital, they have a broken arm, they pretend that they are their brother because that brother is insured.
Right.
Now, with artificial intelligence, you can detect this kind of fraud, which is a benefit for all of us. Yeah, but fraud is never good. Yeah, and it is a very tight scope that we have there. Yeah, for a particular question, it has a huge benefit in a healthcare setting. Yeah. And I think that is the way that we should start tackling this. How can we really improve step by step with the help of artificial intelligence algorithms, individual processes that we are taking care of.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So what are some examples? You've given a couple of sort of specific examples, and as you say, they're sort of very, very tightly focused. Mm-hmm. Do you see the next few years as being focused on additional tightly focused algorithms, or at what point do you see things going to a higher level of abstraction?
Yeah, I think that what is the first steps that we see at the moment are chatbots, for instance, that they also use artificial intelligence to be able to recognize the voice of the patient, so the patient can fill out surveys on an iPhone, for instance, or on a smart device with voice. Yeah. And that is something which is a very simple scenario. I think that will become more and more important, also within a hospital setting. Yeah? And that's a very practical usage of artificial intelligence. The other ones are the things in things like billing, insurance, etc., where you can start making predictions, for instance. Yeah, how long is somebody in a hospital? You can also think about antibiotics resistance. That's also a huge topic where you can also, with artificial intelligence, try to get a grip on this problem. Yeah? And then, of course, I think the next wave will probably be that you really start looking, we start to automate maybe parts of the job of the physician more, or augment that person's role. And, of course, I think the holy grail that everybody speaks of is image recognition. Yeah? If I get a picture of prostate cancer, for instance, a specialist, an expert can very quickly recognize what is the tumor tissue in the specimen that I have. I think that if we can move there, that we can automate this would be very, very helpful, because it takes a lot of the weight from the physician, right, from the person who has to do the diagnosis in the end, who can then spend more time with the patient, basically. But I think it is still a bit of a holy grail, because if I talk to people in the field, they say, we need the annotated data sets for this. Yeah, we have to have the very sound data sets from which we can learn and start
for
building.
Training. Yeah, right.
And the difficulty is, of course, it is not that bad if you have maybe a false positive, but a false negative can be very extreme. It can be very bad in this case.
Right, of course. If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on HealthcareNOW Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Dr. Clemens Suter-Crazzolara. So I understand that Europe may be a couple steps ahead of the U.S. in terms of adopting a framework for thinking about AI ethics in healthcare. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that if we look at the European space in general, of course, one of the key things that has changed, which you are definitely aware of, is the GDPR. Yeah, that is the Global Data Protection Regulation, which I think for many people in Europe, and also definitely in the US and other countries, came as a bit of a shock, because people thought this is really something which is going to hamper a lot of the work that we do. I think the atmosphere, what I notice at the moment is that people are beginning to say, well, actually, it is one of the most modern laws there is, because it is one one of the first laws that was put in place actually to comprehensively protect our data. Yeah? Of course, the GDPR has an effect on artificial intelligence because you need this patient data to be able to train these algorithms in the end. Yeah? And I would actually say it is one of the guiding principles that we have to follow, because we are having the discussion to think about what are the ethics of artificial intelligence. And of course, I think that data privacy and the protection of personal information is of course one of the crucial things that we have to think about if we start thinking about artificial intelligence.
Right. I mean, we sort of started at the end of the conversation with the use of the application of the algorithms, but you're taking us way back and talking about the development of the algorithms and the ethics around collecting information, identifying the uses of the data up front, because historically folks have tended to try to slip that in at the bottom of the long disclosure that nobody reads and signs off on, and then things are used later on. I mean, in the U.S., we have the notion of the de-identified data under HIPAA that can be used for these secondary uses. But as the world progresses, more and more things, I would say, are not really capable of being de-identified, right?
Yeah, that's true.
There's certainly in the genomic data arena, that's an issue, and in many other areas as well. There's we just have a tremendous amount of data about us out there, and things can be re-identified.
Definitely.
Without too much difficulty, without too much heavy lifting. So, do you see that as sort of the front end, the data collection, as sort of the key ethical gateway that we go through in order to develop AI?
Yeah, I think it is definitely one important point. Yeah, I think the GDPR and data protection is something that has to be top of mind. I think the other things that I see as very important is, of course, that we always say this human being that we are working with has to be at the center. Yeah,
right.
We have to be really very careful that anything that we do in artificial intelligence has to be very serious. You know, you cannot joke around with this stuff. Yeah, you want to really make sure that we protect the patient in the end and improve this patient's life. And the other thing that I also hinted at a couple of times, perhaps, is that we have on the other side the physicians, and not only the physicians or medical doctors, or you also have the nurses, etc. Right? So there are a lot of employees working in this area, and these people also are a bit worried about these technologies. And they, of course, are thinking, is this going to replace me? And that is what I meant before, These technologies always have to be around augmenting what these people do. They should help the employees in the end. And as you perhaps are aware of these discussions, is artificial intelligence in the end going to cost jobs? Right. That's a discussion that we have at SAP quite extensively. Of course, also at SAP, we have not put down our bets. I see it myself a bit maybe as the development of the industrial revolution, where a lot of new jobs that nobody had ever thought about suddenly were discovered. Yeah? And my hope and my belief is also that for artificial intelligence, we will see this also happening. But it is still something that we have to be very conscious about, because it will have an impact on the workforce, definitely.
Right. I mean, the sort of the single largest growing job description is probably data scientist these days, right? So that's what we're dealing with, and sort of moving forward, sort of a new industrial revolution, so to speak, in changing the way people work. So what do you think enabled the development of GDPR? What sort of motivated that? Were we doing things terribly wrong? Were people disgusted? Is that what leads us to changes like this, or is it something else?
I think that people got a bit worried about what was happening to their data. Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is, of course, at the moment we also have a large a globalization in the world, right, which has taken place. And there are many different players in this space who are interested in our health data, if we think simply about health data. Mm-hmm. And I think that the biggest driver behind it was this concern, what is going to happen to my data as an individual. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit, if you will, about sort of your view on the sort of social responsibility of the developers of these tools.
Yeah.
How do you see that as factoring into all of this?
I think that is absolutely crucial, because I think in artificial intelligence there's no way that you can say I'm going to implement this and people will simply swallow it and use it. Because in the end, and you said this at the very beginning, that these algorithms can actually modify themselves over time. That is something which, even for me, from a technological company, sounds a bit, okay, sounds nice, but is that really what we would like to have? Right. Yeah, I would like to have some controls on this. Huh? So I think that we really have to think about ethics around this topic. Yeah? And I mean, I'm very pleased that at SAP we have guidelines for how we deal with artificial intelligence. We are definitely not the only ones. We were one of first largest provider who started doing this. But you really have to get the stakeholders in such a company on board. You have to have a steering board that thinks about the ethics of artificial intelligence. We have that in place. So all the people from the various areas, so development, from legal, product management, all these people sit around the table regularly and say, okay, let's look at all the cases that we are working on at the moment and at the trends that are happening. Yeah? And that is, I think, absolutely crucial that you do this. You have to have this governance, because otherwise I think you also lose a lot of believability with a user in it, if you don't do that.
Right. So do you see that as a differentiator for your company, or do you see others in this space taking the same sorts of approaches?
Well, I wouldn't say it is really a strong differentiator, because many technological providers are, of course, working in artificial intelligence. Maybe we are a bit faster than other ones. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can well be. But I think that many of them take this topic very, very seriously. Yeah. So it is really a trend where we see that everybody is thinking about how do we handle this in a very conscious way, conscientious way.
So could you give an example of maybe an issue, aside from sort of policy development, if an issue comes up as work is being done, technical work is being done, do issues come back to this committee for deliberation, particular issues, or is everyone in the field sort of authorized and enabled, empowered to apply these rules? Or do you come back to a central place to deliberate?
Yeah, so I mean, the process at SAP is that if we produce a product and we put it on the market, there's a catalog of about 250 line items that we have to think about, that have to be cross-checked. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And these are simple standards for software development.
Sure.
Yeah? And now that catalog has been extended with additional queries that everybody who is doing artificial intelligence will have to think about. How does this work, etc. Yeah? And then I think what is also very important, that is simply how we deliver the software. But the other thing that is important is, of course, how do we educate the customer or the user about this algorithm? So what is very important as well is that there is a full transparency about what this algorithm does, how it was built, what kind of data were used, etc., etc. So that the end customer can understand, okay, I know what this thing is doing. Yeah? And that data is and that information is publicly available, so we make that available to our customers.
Very good. So, if you were to wake up 5 years in the future and think about what has happened from now to then, what is one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect would have changed radically?
I have one very broad category, and that is everything that has to do with diagnosis and prevention. Yeah.
Oh, is that all?
That's all. It's very, very broad. But I think that is really where I see the power for this, right? That we can really say we take the data from an individual with smart algorithms. We can start analyzing this data, and we can really start preventing the disease from developing in a person. Yeah? That would be on the healthcare side my biggest wish. Yeah? It will take a bit before we get there, I admit. Yeah.
Right. Well, great.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at HealthcareNOWradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowNHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.